Joining us now for reaction, Bruce LeVell, who is the executive director of the National Diversity Coalition for Trump, and Scott Bolton, the Democratic strategist. Welcome to you both.
Thank you.
Thanks.
All right,
Thanks,
Scott, I'll start with you. Have you heard that term before? Because I went around and did a little digging too. Some people attribute it to Plato, some to Shakespeare. But a lot of people feel like when there's an ugly dust-up like this, people go to race as the issue. Do you think this is an issue about race?
Well, race plays a factor in so many parts of our daily lives, whether we want to admit that or not, primarily with people of color as opposed to others. That being said, I don't know whether it's a racist term or not. It would be new in my vernacular, if you will, but let's just say this. It was certainly an offensive term, and one in which had no real basis. Even if you disagreed with Congresswoman Wilson, name calling coming out of the White House, empty barrel, wacky, and what have you, really has no place in our dialogue about this. Remember, we got 4 dead soldiers, and they're underneath all of this. And then in the top screen, you have the president and Kelly and Wilson going back and forth with the name calling, with the accusations, with the lies. We got videos and what have you, and we don't even know why our men were in Niger and how they died, why 2 were left over. And I'll be honest with you, I think it's disgusting and sad, and I don't think the name calling helps anything at all. I think both sides bear some responsibility, but the reality is this White House and Kelly and Trump, they drive this narrative. They love to fight, and they're driving the narrative of name calling and what have you to a sitting congressman. Why is she an empty barrel? It's offensive because there's no depth or substance, at least allegedly, but why is she an empty barrel? Simply because they disagree with her. She happens to be African American. You're going to take your cues from that, or most people will. Well,
and Bruce, today she actually said in an interview with the New York Times that the White House is full of white supremacists.
Oh, wow. You know, it's so sad, Shannon, and thanks for having me. You know, unfortunately, I've been dealing with this race mess all the way since 2015. The Democrat Party is failing. The CBC is special interests and lobbyists backed. They have no plan. Their DNC is in shambles. They're $3.5 million in debt. They have no policy. Every time they get pushed up against the wall, the only thing they can come up is race. The unfortunate part of it is, you know, I was thinking about this empty barrel deal. My dad, who's a retired command sergeant major, he actually made a comment to me one time in high school about, you ain't talking about nothing, you like an empty barrel. My dad is African American, newsflash. So to take this and to drive it into something that's race, it's typical of the Democrat Party now is to come out with this narrative to paint everyone that's a racist, that the president's racist, John Kelly. You know, this is drama. Thing too, I actually got to meet General Kelly 3 weeks ago at the West Wing, and I got to talk to him. I told my dad, as retired sergeant major, my uncle served in Vietnam twice, like my daddy served twice in Vietnam. My uncles all served. They're all master sergeants. I grew up in Fort Hood. I grew up in a military rich family. I've been to funerals where these soldiers are laid under flags. My dad's fallen comrade coming back to Fort Hood, going to a funeral as a little boy with the gun salutes and all the things and all the family crying because he had a friend that lost his life. Let me tell you something. General Kelly, what everyone didn't really talk about is he made reference that he went over to Arlington National Cemetery to get a reflection. He was so upset. What people don't realize is that how hurtful that is to try to paint a narrative to make this general who has to send other soldiers over, you make decisions that these soldiers die and his own son to die. You know,
Bruce,
it's typical.
Have to do with the racism issue? What does that have to do with the racism issue?
Sir,
and the
it's
fact
only
that
racism.
Trump traffics in racism, which is offensive generally. I don't know about the empty barrel, but it's certainly an offensive term generally. If you make it against someone who's black or brown,
no, it's not.
Going to lend itself to the race question, whether it's real or not real.
You guys call the sky is falling racism. You guys call the sky as racism. You guys have the Democrat Party is failing.
I call Gorko racism, and I call.
And let's note that they're not part of the White House anymore.
They're not part of the
White House, and so they have moved on. But Bruce, let me ask you this: were you encouraged by what Scott had to say, and that he said both sides bear some responsibility in this conversation? And the most important thing for everyone is that we have 4 grieving families right now. Do you think it's fair to say that both sides have added to this conversation and this thing ratcheting up to where it is now?
All I know, unfortunately, is we have some gentlemen that went home to the Lord that lost their lives in battle, who will lay under that flag, who who have fought for me to sit on this show and to be where I'm at as a black business owner here in Atlanta, and all the freedoms that we cherish so much is because of that gentleman that lost his life, and General Kelly, who served, and my father, and my uncles, and everything else. The president made reference that he called the folks, the families, and he was I know the president of the United States, ladies and gentlemen. He is a good man. Remember now, he signed that executive order to let veterans, for the first time in the history of the United States, choose another hospital. As candidate Trump, before he was President Trump, he raised $5 million for veterans as a candidate. The list goes on.
Yeah, Bruce, I want to make sure that we
So the
bring Scott back
passion
in here.
runs deep.
Yeah,
the passion runs deep.
Is it possible, Scott, that what the president was saying, his remarks about this young man, this gentleman knew what he was choosing, was meant as a compliment to say, we don't have a draft now. Everybody who signs up, these are people who are selfless. There are heroes because they know what they potentially are walking into. Do you think that's potentially been misinterpreted in this?
The reality is this. Donald Trump can be both. He can both traffic in racism, but he can be very patriotic, if you will. Now, how the family processed and what they heard from Donald Trump, and compared to what Donald Trump said and what he meant, they could both be right. I'm sure he was rather clumsy with it because Donald Trump doesn't have a history of servant leadership or a history of consoling. He cares about money, his development properties, and his family.
But do you not think that he cares about fallen soldiers as commander-in-chief?
So
because he did reach out to General Kelly, who we all know lost his son and has now had to relive that publicly because of this conversation we're having, and said to General Kelly, how do I make these phone calls?
But he forced that issue, and then he politicized Kelly's death of his own son by forcing his chief of staff out there to relive and talk about something painful.
I don't think anybody forces General Kelly to do it.
You don't force him.
Let me just tell you this, okay? He's part of the White House. He's the chief of staff, and if he did it on his own, fine. But let me just say this to you. Donald Trump, whether he said what he said clumsily or not, right, the reality is if the family processed it that way, certainly there should have been a follow-up call to explain, because both could be right and both sides could be wrong. But why are we driving this narrative with name-calling and lies and bringing Kelly out and so forth and so on? That's not making him look good, whether it's a race issue or not. In fact, it's making him look like he's on the ground fighting when he's the president, and he ought to be presidential and consoler-in-chief. He continues to fail in these important areas, but he has no record of it. And so I don't get it. I don't let him off the hook with it, Shannon. What I think is both sides could have misunderstood. Both sides probably ought to be talking, but they ought to stop driving this narrative of negativity. Yeah. That's what's wrong with this country, and that's what you get with a Trump White House.
Well, all right, Bruce, I'll give you a chance to respond to that, because I know a lot of people think that there's gasoline coming onto the fire from both ends of this. I mean, is it better? Is it an idea that these parties to this have another private conversation where the president could have a chance to console or clarify in a different way? Or do you think that it's been
non-disclosure agreement.
Right? Or do you think it's been so politicized at this point, Bruce, that there's just no way to wrap it up civilly?
Well, you know, all this drama started with Congressman Wilson, and I have been through this many times as excuse me, I didn't cut you off, sir. I didn't. Excuse me.
You know it.
Excuse me, I didn't interrupt you. I didn't interrupt you. Okay, fix the failing DNC party. Listen. Congressman Wilson.
Focus. All right, let's focus on the task.
It is what it is. Congressman Wilson should spend more time in her district with a very extremely high unemployment rate and concentrate on trying to bring jobs back to her district instead of making up this false narrative on the president. I don't know what her motive is or what she's trying to do, but it's doing a disservice to her district with a 16+% unemployment rate, with over 600,000 residents, with a predominantly African-American district, which, by the way, President Trump, in his tenure since he's been president, we have the highest unemployment rate for African Americans. Also, newsflash, he has the highest African-American votes since Richard Nixon and climbing. So you guys keep this up. We're going to double it in 2020 because if you guys don't get a plan together, the whole DNC is just going to totally fall off the cliff.
Yeah, you're way off subject. She's a hero in her community.
No, I'm not off subject.
And working hard on all those
because if you're a congressperson,
come on now,
we've gotten off topic.
You need to be concentrating on your constituents.
I'm going to ask you both to go a little kumbaya on me now because we're out of time. And again, And I think that the good thing is that we all agree, and we do recognize that the most important thing here are those 4 grieving families. Congress is going to be fighting to get answers. The Defense Secretary was on the Hill today. We'll talk more about that coming up because that is the most important thing. Bruce and Scott, thank you both very much.
Right.